During an engagement party, a child exposes a lie, silencing a room packed with high society. The bombshell drops when she describes a fake baby bump she found hidden in the bathroom. But the scandal is just the beginning of a dangerous plot filled with lies and revenge. If you're intrigued by this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's continue. The water was just a foot away. 12 inches that might as well have been 20 miles. Richard Miller stared at the glass on the end table with an intensity that bordered on the absurd. At 52, the man had run multi-million-dollar businesses, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, and crossed oceans in private jets. Now he couldn't reach a simple glass of water. His fingers stretched out, trembling slightly. The motorized wheelchair was positioned wrong, a few inches beyond his ideal reach. He could adjust it with the controller, but something inside him refused. It was as if accepting this small defeat meant admitting all the others. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, not from physical effort, but from the rage that rose like bile in his throat. The mansion around him was deathly quiet. 16 rooms, all equipped with state-of-the-art technology, automated systems that responded to voice commands, heated floors, windows that tinted themselves according to the sunlight. A fortress of comfort that had become an impeccable prison. There were no footsteps echoing on the marble hallways, no distant conversations from the gourmet kitchen he'd never used, just the low hum of the central air and the occasional sound of the house adjusting its own functions. Richard gave up on the glass. His hands fell heavily onto the armrests of the chair. That's when it happened. The thing he feared most, the thing that had been happening more and more often in recent weeks. The tears came without permission. They weren't dramatic, sobbing tears. They were worse. They were silent, streaming down a face that remained motionless, as if his body had decided to express what his mind refused to process. 3 years and 7 months, that was how long it had been since the accident, since the car had flipped on the wet highway, since he'd woken up in a hospital room unable to feel his own legs, since the doctor had said those words he still refused to fully accept. The spinal injuries were extensive. At the moment, there's no movement below the waist. At the moment. He had clung to those 3 words like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. But the moments had turned into months, and the months into years. And the driftwood had begun to rot in his hands. The service entrance doorbell rang. Richard wiped his face, with the back of his hand, trying to regain some composure. It was Tuesday, the day Maria came to clean. He considered going to his bedroom, locking himself in until she was done, as he usually did. But he was too tired even for that. The sound of light footsteps in the service hallway reached him before the woman appeared. Maria Garcia was 43, with hands calloused from work and a smile she kept more to herself than for the world. She had worked there for a year and a half, always punctual, always discreet, always efficient. Perfect for someone, like Richard, who paid well for the right to be left alone. But on this Tuesday, Maria wasn't alone. A small girl appeared behind her, clutching a worn-out notebook to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 7. She wore a simple dress, patched at the shoulder, and sandals that had seen better days. Her eyes, however, were what caught his attention. They were too observant, too old for a face still full of childhood softness. "Mr. Miller," Maria began, and there was something different in her voice, a fragility he'd never heard before. "I am so sorry. Isabella's school had a plumbing problem. They let the kids out early. I have no one to leave her with. I promise she won't be any trouble. She'll stay quiet while I work." Richard opened his mouth to say no, to explain that this was his house, his space, and that there was no room for children here. But before he could form the words, Isabella took a step forward. "You were crying," she said. It wasn't a question. Maria pulled her daughter back by the arm, her face red with embarrassment. "Isabella, where are your manners? Apologize to the gentleman." But the girl didn't look away. She tilted her head slightly like a little bird studying something curious. "Crying is good for you. My teacher said tears carry the bad stuff out, but praying is even better." Something in the way she said it, with a conviction so pure and yet so devoid of naivety, made Richard hesitate. He didn't believe in prayer. He didn't believe in much beyond what he could touch, measure, control. But there was something in those eyes that stopped him from simply dismissing her with the cruel words already forming on his tongue. "Isabella, please," Maria insisted, her voice almost a desperate whisper. "Go to the laundry room now." But Isabella didn't move. Instead, she did something completely unexpected. She knelt right there, on the Italian marble floor that had cost a fortune, closed her eyes, and folded her small hands. Richard was frozen. So was Maria. The silence of the mansion seemed to deepen, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The girl didn't ask for him to walk. She didn't ask for riches or spectacular miracles. Her voice, quiet and steady, asked for courage. For peace in the middle of the night when fear came. For company on the long days. For a heart that wouldn't forget how to smile. And then something happened that Richard couldn't explain, something that later he would try to rationalize in every possible way, a tingling, faint, almost imperceptible but undeniable. It started in the sole of his left foot, traveled up to his ankle, and vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He gasped. Maria looked at him, alarmed. "Mr. Miller, are you all right?" Isabella opened her eyes and stood up, brushing the dust from her dress. She looked at him with that unnerving serenity and said, "It's going to be okay now." Before Richard could answer, before he could process what he had just felt, the girl turned and walked toward the laundry room, swinging her notebook by her side, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Maria stood there, torn between following her daughter and checking if her employer was really okay. Richard gave a vague wave of his hand, dismissing her. She hesitated another moment before giving a slight nod, and following through the same door Isabella had passed through. Alone again, Richard looked down at his own legs. Motionless, as always. He tried to wiggle his toes. Nothing. He tried to flex his ankle. Nothing. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the desperate desire to feel something, anything, creating illusions in a body that no longer responded. But when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the echo of that tingling. And something more. Something he hadn't felt in years and that didn't have a proper name. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was more subtle. It was the possibility of hope. A crack in the door he believed was permanently locked. The rest of the afternoon passed, in a strange haze. Richard stayed in his home office trying to focus on emails and financial reports, but his thoughts kept returning to those few minutes. To the girl's eyes, to that simple prayer, to the tingling that may or may not have been real. When Maria came to say goodbye, Isabella appeared at her side again. The girl looked at Richard and smiled. It wasn't a forced or polite smile. It was genuine, warm, as if she knew a wonderful secret and was keeping it just for herself. "See you next week, Mr. Miller," Maria said, already turning. "To leave." "Wait." The word left Richard's mouth before he could think. The two of them turned, surprised. He didn't know what he was going to say. He hadn't planned anything. But the words came anyway. "Isabella can come back. Next Tuesday. If she wants." The girl tilted her head again in that peculiar way she had. "I'll be back, but I'm not going to pray for you to walk." Maria's eyes widened, mortified. "Isabella!" But Richard felt the corners of his own mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest he'd come in months. "No, no," Isabella confirmed, with all the seriousness in the world. "I'm going to pray for you to be happy, because happy people don't need to walk to live. They're already truly alive." And with that sentence, spoken with the devastating simplicity of childhood, Isabella walked out the door, leaving Richard alone in a mansion that, for the first time in years, didn't feel completely empty. That night, lying in his modified bed, with all the medical equipment around him and the darkness pressing against the windows, Richard tried to wiggle his toes again. Nothing. But when he closed his eyes, instead of the usual despair, something different came. The image of a little girl kneeling on a marble floor, the memory of words about courage and peace, and a question he couldn't answer. What exactly had happened that afternoon? And more importantly, what would happen next Tuesday? The week that followed was strange. Richard found himself waiting for Tuesday, with an anxiety he couldn't name. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It was more like the feeling before an important doctor's appointment, when you don't know if you'll get good news or bad, but you know something is going to change. On Monday night, he almost called Maria to cancel, almost said he had an important meeting, that the house didn't need cleaning that week, any excuse that sounded remotely plausible. But he didn't call, and when he woke up on Tuesday, his heart was beating faster than it should. Isabella arrived at 2 in the afternoon with her mother. She wore the same patched dress, but this time she carried her sketchbook open in her hands. She walked into the living room where Richard was, without asking permission, and simply sat on the floor next to his wheelchair. "Can I draw here?" she asked, already opening a case of colored pencils that looked like they'd seen better days. Richard didn't know how to respond. No one ever asked his permission for something so simple. People asked for meetings, authorizations, signatures. They didn't ask to draw on his living room floor. "You can," he replied, surprised by his own voice. Maria passed by the doorway, carrying cleaning supplies, and shot a worried look at her daughter. Isabella gave her a little wave, a small gesture that said, "It's okay," and turned her attention back to the paper. The silence that settled was different from the usual silence of the mansion. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of a pencil scratching on paper, the soft breathing of the concentrated girl, the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard watched the small hands choosing colors, drawing lines. She was drawing a house, but not an ordinary house. It was huge, full of windows, with a giant garden around it. "That's too big for a house," Richard commented, without thinking. Isabella looked up, considering. "It's not for me, it's for kids who don't have a home." Something cold shot through Richard's chest. He knew that phrase, or something very much like it. From where? "Why do you want a house for homeless kids?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Because everyone deserves a place. A real place, you know. Not just a roof, but a place where you can be who you are." She went back to her drawing, adding flowers to the garden. "My mom says that when you really want something, you have to think about it every day. Drawing helps you think." Richard closed his eyes. The memory came with painful clarity. He was 17. He had just aged out of the group home where he'd grown up, with a scholarship to college and a backpack containing all his possessions. Before leaving, he had written a letter to the director. In it, he promised that one day he would come back, that he would build a better place, that no child would have to feel what he had felt, the loneliness of not belonging anywhere. 35 years had passed. He had built a fortune, but he had never gone back to the children's home. He had never kept that promise. "Are you okay?" Isabella asked, watching him with those two observant eyes. "Yes," Richard lied, but his voice came out choked. The girl put down her pencil and stood up. Without asking, without warning, she simply took his hand. The small, warm hand enveloped Richard's cold fingers, and she just stood there next to his chair in silence. They stayed like that for minutes that seemed suspended in time. Richard couldn't remember the last time someone had held his hand, not for medical necessity, not out of obligation, but just to be there. The feeling was both comforting and terrifying. "You know what my grandma used to say?" Isabella finally spoke, her quiet voice breaking the silence. "That God doesn't fix everything at once, because we need to learn from what's broken." Richard opened his mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, something he didn't expect came. The urge to tell the truth, to say that he didn't believe in God, that he thought prayer was just a way for people to console themselves for their own powerlessness. But looking at that little girl, at the sincerity in her eyes, he couldn't. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," was all he managed to say. Isabella smiled and went back to her drawing. Richard watched her, and for the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to think about something beyond his own pain. He thought about the imaginary children who would live in the giant house in the drawing. He thought about the 17-year-old boy who had promised to make a difference in the world. He thought about how time had turned that hopeful boy into a bitter man, trapped in a wheelchair. When Maria finished her work and came to get Isabella, the girl packed up her supplies carefully. Before leaving, however, she turned to Richard. Can I ask you a question? You can. Did you ever have a dream? Like something you really wanted to do when you grew up? The question was so direct, so innocent in its complexity, that Richard had to swallow hard before answering. I did, a long time ago. And what happened to it? Richard looked out the window, at the garden perfectly manicured by landscapers he'd never met. I grew up, and I forgot. Isabella nodded, as if that made all the sense in the world. Then you need to remember, because dreams don't die. They just wait for us to come back to them. After they left, Richard was left alone with those words echoing in his mind. Dreams don't die. They just wait. Could it be true? Was there still time for that 17-year-old boy to keep his promise? That night, for the first time in years, Richard turned on his computer and searched. He searched for group homes, for foster care facilities, for social projects. He read statistics about children in vulnerable situations. He saw numbers that made him sick to his stomach. Tens of thousands in his region alone, millions in the entire country. He had money, more than he could spend in several lifetimes, but he had never thought of using it for that. He had used it to build his fortress of comfort, to ensure his independence, to control every aspect of his limited life. And suddenly all of it seemed small, insignificant. The days that followed were different. Richard started making calls. He contacted lawyers specializing in foundations, architects with experience in social projects, social workers who could guide him. People were surprised. Richard Miller, the reclusive millionaire who hadn't given an interview in years, was interested in philanthropy. The news leaked, as it always did. On Thursday, a small article appeared on a corporate gossip blog. Wheelchair-bound tycoon plans social project, a PR stunt. Richard read it and ignored it. He was used to speculation, but on Friday, things changed. A news site published something more serious. Richard Miller, under alleged influence of religious child, plans to donate fortune. The phone started ringing. Richard didn't answer, but the messages piled up. And then on Saturday morning, his brother showed up. Edward Miller was 48 and had the ability to make any room feel smaller with his presence. He didn't ring the bell. He used a key Richard didn't even know he had and just walked in. "We need to talk," Edward said, planting himself in front of Richard's wheelchair. "Now." Richard stared at him. They hadn't spoken in almost a year, since their last argument about the will. Edward had always made it clear that he considered his brother's fortune a waste in the hands of a reclusive cripple, as he'd called him, in a moment of anger. "We have nothing to talk about," Richard replied, trying to move the chair past him. Edward blocked his path. "You're losing your mind. A kid, seriously? You're being manipulated and you don't even see it. Get out of my house. This house is a family asset, and I'm not going to let you throw everything away because of some clever cleaning lady and her daughter." Richard felt the rage rise like lava. "I said get out. Not until you sign these papers." Edward threw a folder onto the table. "It's a petition for a temporary conservatorship, for your own good, while you're not in a condition to make rational decisions." The silence that followed was as thick as lead. Richard looked at the folder, then at his brother, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. "You think I'm going to sign my own conservatorship petition? I think you don't have a choice. I've already spoken with lawyers. I have evidence of erratic behavior. You're making major decisions under the influence of third parties. Any judge will agree." Richard moved the chair closer, looking his brother straight in the eye. "Then go ahead, file the petition and prepare for a war you're not going to win." Edward smiled, but it was a cold smile. "I already have, bro. The proceedings start on Monday." After his brother left, Richard stared at the folder without opening it. He knew what was inside. He knew Edward wasn't bluffing. And for the first time, he felt fear. Not fear of losing the money, but fear of losing the chance to do something that mattered. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. Just a photo. The photo showed Isabella leaving school, surrounded by two men with cameras. She was crying. Beneath the photo, a message. "Be careful who you choose to trust. This story could end badly for everyone." Richard felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't about him. It had never been just about him. And now, an innocent girl was being dragged into the middle of a war she didn't even understand. He picked up the phone and dialed. When Maria answered, her voice was trembling. "Mr. Miller, I saw the news. I'm so sorry. Isabella is very shaken. I think it's best if we don't come back anymore." "Maria, wait!" But she had already hung up. Richard was alone in the silence of the mansion. But this time the silence wasn't just empty. It was suffocating. It was guilt. It was the feeling that in trying to do something good, he had destroyed the only pure thing that had entered his life in years, and there was no way to fix it. No way to undo what had been done. For the first time since the accident, Richard wished he could just disappear. But dreams don't die. A voice echoed in his mind. They just wait. The question was there still time to go back to them? Or had he lost his last chance? Sunday dawned grey. Richard hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night in the living room, staring into the void, trying to find a solution that didn't seem to exist. At 7 in the morning, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and called his personal lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a meticulous man who had worked with him for 15 years. "I need you to prepare a defense," Richard said, as soon as Marcus answered. "My brother has filed for a conservatorship. I want all the medical documents, psychiatric evaluations, everything that proves my full mental capacity." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, this is going to get ugly, very ugly. The press will—" "I know what the press will do. I don't care. Just prepare the defense." But Richard knew that documents wouldn't be enough. Edward had something he didn't, a narrative. The story of a depressed, reclusive man being manipulated by a needy family. It was simple, convincing, and worse. It had elements of truth. He needed his own narrative, and for that, he needed to understand what was really happening to him. On Monday morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He left the house. He asked his driver, George, to get him ready for a trip. George, a 60-year-old man who had known Richard since before the accident, didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and prepared the modified van. The destination was an address Richard had found in Maria's employment file. A simple neighborhood, modest houses packed close together, narrow streets where kids played on the sidewalk. When the van parked in front of Maria's house, a few people stopped to stare. It wasn't every day a modified Mercedes showed up. "There." Richard took a deep breath. He pressed the button that lowered the ramp and rolled down, maneuvering the chair with his hands. The front door of the house was ajar. He could hear voices inside. He knocked. The sound seemed to echo louder than it should. Maria appeared at the door. When she saw who it was, her face went pale. "Mr. Miller, you shouldn't be here. People will see. They'll take pictures. This will make everything worse." "I know. But I need to talk to you and Isabella." Maria looked back, hesitant. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in, quickly." The house was small but lovingly organized. Old but clean furniture, simple curtains, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Isabella was sitting at the kitchen table, picking at a plate of food she clearly had no desire to eat. When she saw Richard, her eyes widened. "You came," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. Richard moved the chair closer to the table. "I came, and I need to apologize." "Apologize?" Maria asked, confused. "For putting you in the middle of this. I should have predicted my family would react this way, that people would react this way. I should have protected you better." Isabella put down her fork. "My mom says that sometimes good people suffer because of bad people, and that it's not the good people's fault." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Your mom is very wise, but still, I'm sorry. And I came to tell you that you don't have to worry. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make it all stop." "How?" Maria asked, and there was a weariness in her voice that went beyond the physical. "By giving up the project. By saying publicly that it was a misunderstanding, that I'm not in a condition to make important decisions. Edward will get what he wants and you'll be left in peace." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Isabella slammed her hand on the table, making the plates rattle. "No," she said, and there was a firmness in her voice that didn't match her 7 years. "You can't give up." "Isabella, honey," Maria began. "No, Mom." He can't. The girl looked at Richard with eyes shining with unshed tears. You promised. To that boy you used to be, you promised you'd come back, that you'd help. Richard felt like he'd been punched. How do you know about that? You told me. Not with words, but I saw it. In your eyes. When I talked about the big house. You weren't just listening. You were remembering. Maria looked between her daughter and Richard, trying to understand. Richard found himself unable to look away from those childish eyes that saw too much. It's not that simple, Isabella. There's a lot at stake. Your safety, your mother's reputation, everything. I'm not scared, Isabella interrupted. Those men with the cameras were scary at first. But you know what my teacher said? That people who do wrong things always try to scare the people who do right things, because it's the only weapon they have. Richard looked at Maria, seeking some support. But the woman was looking at her daughter with an expression he couldn't decipher. Pride? Fear? Maybe both. Maria, please talk to her. This could get dangerous. Maria took a deep breath. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Mr. Miller, can I ask you a question? Of course. This project, this idea of helping children, is it real or was it just something you thought of to make yourself feel better? The question was like a direct hit. Richard had to think before he answered. It was real. It is real. When I had the idea, for the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just existing, but then don't give up. Maria sat down, her hands folded on the table. My daughter is right. Bad people will try to scare you. They'll lie. They'll do everything to stop you. But if you give up now, they win. And more importantly, those kids you wanted to help, they lose. Richard felt something churn in his stomach. But what about you? What about Isabella's safety? Isabella got up from her chair and walked over to Richard. She took his hand again, that gesture that was becoming familiar. My grandma used to say something else too, that we're only truly safe when we're doing what's right, because even if bad things happen, we know we're on the right side of the story. Richard looked at that small girl and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just admiration, it was respect, deep and genuine. You're not afraid of anything, are you? Isabella thought for a moment. I'm afraid of lots of things, thunder, the dark sometimes, losing my mom. Her voice got quieter. But I'm not afraid of mean people, because mean people have already lost the most important part. They've lost their kindness, and I'd rather have fear in kindness than no fear and no kindness. At that moment, sitting in the simple kitchen of that modest house, Richard Miller made a decision. It wouldn't be easy. It would be a war. But it would be his war, and for the first time in years it would be for something bigger than himself. Okay, he said, I won't give up, but on one condition. What's that? Maria asked. You accept security. I'm going to hire trustworthy people to make sure Isabella is protected. At school, on her way. I won't risk her life because of my fight. Maria hesitated, but Isabella squeezed Richard's hand. Okay, but I'm still going to pray. Every day. Richard smiled, a small but real smile. I won't stop you. When he left the house half an hour later, Richard felt different. The weight was still there, the chair still limited his movements, the conservatorship. Hearing still awaited him. But there was something new too, there was purpose, there was a fight, and there were two people who believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. In the van, on the way home, his phone rang. It was Marcus. Richard, we need to talk urgently. The conservatorship proceedings have been moved to a preliminary hearing. Next week. So soon. Edward has connections. And a strategy. He's going to claim you're at imminent risk of squandering the family assets under undue influence. He's going to ask for an injunction to freeze your assets until the final decision. Richard closed his eyes. So that's how it was going to be, all-out war. Marcus, I want you to do something for me. I want a medical panel. Psychiatrists, neurologists, the best you can find. I want full reports proving my mental capacity, and I want them before the hearing. It's going to be expensive, and I don't care about the cost. Just do it. When he hung up, He looked out the window. The city passed in a blur, people on the streets, living their lives, oblivious to the silent battles being fought behind closed doors. And in cold courtrooms, Richard thought of Isabella, of her 2 old eyes, of her courage that should be impossible for someone so young. He thought of Maria, working hard to give her daughter a future, even when that future seemed uncertain. And he thought of himself, the man he had been, the man he had become, and the man that maybe, just maybe, he could still be. The war was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Richard Miller wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. And that made all the difference. When he got home, he found a new flood of messages, reporters wanting interviews, bloggers asking for comments, and an email from his wife, Beatrice, whom he hadn't seen in over a year. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." Richard opened the email, and the first lines made his blood run cold. "Richard, I saw the news. Edward is right. You're not well, and I can't stay silent anymore." The world, it seemed, was turning against him. But as he looked out the window of his mansion, at the garden he had never appreciated, Richard remembered Isabella's words. Mean people have already lost the most important part, and he still had his. The week leading up to the hearing was a whirlwind. Richard underwent 3 complete psychiatric evaluations, 2 neurological assessments, and countless hours of interviews with his legal team. Every doctor reached the same conclusion. He was fully capable, mentally sound, and showed no signs of manipulation or instability. But the medical reports were only half the battle. The other half was happening on the streets, on the internet, in the newspapers. Crippled millionaire or modern-day saint? The real story behind Richard Miller's transformation, read one headline. Cleaning lady and daughter allegedly extorting. Vulnerable businessman, sources say, read another. Each day the story became a little more distorted. Richard tried not to read, but it was impossible. The notifications came non-stop. People he didn't even know had strong opinions about his sanity, his intentions, his life. The worst was when a video channel published a behavioral analysis where a supposed expert pointed out clear signs of emotional manipulation in a video shot by paparazzi of Richard visiting Maria's house. The video got 3 million views in 2 days, but Richard stayed focused. Every morning, he woke up at 6, did 2 hours of physical therapy with a therapist who came just for him, and then dove into the work of structuring the foundation. He spoke with over 20 social organizations, studied models of care, and virtually toured dozens of projects across the country. And every afternoon, Isabella showed up. Against all of Maria's recommendations, against the advice of the security guards Richard had hired, the girl insisted on coming. She didn't pray anymore. She just sat there, drawing, talking about school, telling silly stories that made her laugh. Richard realized those moments were the only times he could breathe properly. On the Thursday, before the hearing, Beatrice appeared. Richard hadn't seen her in person since the accident. She had left the hospital 3 days after he woke up, saying she needed time to process everything. That time had now lasted over 3 years. She was still beautiful. 45, with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes, but there was a hardness in her eyes that Richard didn't remember seeing before. "You look better," she said, sitting on the living room sofa uninvited. "Beatrice, I wasn't expecting you. Edward called me. He's worried about you." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Edward is worried. About the inheritance, it's different." Beatrice crossed her legs, studying him. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean he's wrong. You think I'm crazy too? I think you're making questionable choices. A cleaning lady and her daughter, Richard? Seriously, you don't see how this looks." Richard felt the anger boil. How it looks, or how Edward is making it look. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're making decisions that will affect not just you, but a lot of people. And I can't let that happen. You have nothing to do with my decisions, not for 3 years. Beatrice leaned forward, and for the first time Richard saw something beyond the coldness. He saw hurt. "You abandoned me, Richard. When I needed you most, when I tried to stay, you pushed me away. And now, a stranger gets what I never could. She gets to make you feel again." The silence that followed was thick. Richard had no answer for that, because it was true. He had closed himself off to Beatrice. He had turned his pain into walls so high that not even those who loved him could climb them. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "For what I did to you, for the way I pushed you away. But that doesn't change the fact that you left and now you want to come back just to make decisions for me. I want to come back to protect you, from yourself, if necessary. By signing Edward's conservatorship petition." Beatrice looked away, and Richard had his answer. "You already signed it, didn't you?" I thought it was for the best. For you. For us." "There is no us, Beatrice, not for 3 years." She stood up, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You're making a mistake, and by the time you realize it, it'll be too late." After she left, Richard sat alone in the living room, feeling the weight of that revelation. His own wife against him, his brother, probably half of his acquaintances. The phone rang. It was Marcus. "I have news, bad and very bad. Which do you want first?" Richard closed his eyes. The bad. "Edward got an injunction. Your assets are partially frozen until the hearing. You can still use them for basic expenses and maintenance, but any donation or investment in a social project is blocked." "And the very bad?" Marcus hesitated. "Someone leaked information about Maria, about her history." Richard felt his stomach turn. "What kind of information?" 10 years ago, she had a gambling problem, racked up debt, almost lost custody of Isabella. She got herself together, paid everything off, rebuilt her life, but Edward is using it to claim she has a history of predatory behavior, that she might be manipulating you financially." Richard couldn't believe it. "That's ridiculous. She never asked for anything, never accepted anything beyond her salary." "I know, but the narrative is convincing. Woman with a history of financial problems gets close. To a rich, vulnerable man, the papers are going to love it. Make it stop, Marcus, somehow. I'm trying, but Richard, you need to prepare yourself. The hearing is going to be brutal. They're going to dig up everything. Your emotional state after the accident, the periods of depression, that time you told the doctor you wished you hadn't survived. Everything." After hanging up, Richard sat motionless. That sentence, that damn sentence he had said in a moment of despair, 2 months after the accident. Of course it was in his medical records, and of course Edward had found it. The next morning the headlines confirmed his worst fears. Revealed Richard Miller's housekeeper has shadowy past of gambling and debt. Millionaire wished he had died after accident, documents reveal. Richard couldn't get out of bed. For the first time since he had decided to fight, he felt like giving up, like signing the papers, handing everything over to Edward, and just letting the world go on without him. It was Isabella who found him like that in the middle of the afternoon. She had come in through the back door, slipping past the security guards, and just appeared in his bedroom. "You're not really sick," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You're sick here." She touched her own chest. Richard looked at her, his eyes red. "Isabella, you shouldn't be here. Your mother, my mom is crying, because of the news, because of what they're saying about her." The girl's voice trembled. "She says it's all her fault, that she should have stayed away from you." Richard felt like he'd been punched. "None of this is her fault, or yours." "I know, but she doesn't." Isabella took something out of her pocket. It was a folded piece of paper. "I found this in my mom's old papers. She doesn't know I took it." Richard unfolded the paper. It was a letter, addressed to him but never sent, dated 2 years ago. "Mr. Miller, I'm writing this letter I'll never send because I need to get it out. I've worked for you for 6 months and I've never seen anyone so lonely. Not lonely from having no one around, but lonely on the inside. I wish I could help, but I don't know how. I just know that everyone deserves to have someone. And that maybe, one day, you'll find that someone. May God protect you, Maria." Richard read the letter 3 times. He felt something break and rebuild itself in his chest at the same time. "Why did you show me this?" Isabella looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "Because you need to remember that good people exist, and that my mom is one of them, and that good people are worth fighting for." That night, Richard didn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was because he was working. He called Marcus at 3 in the morning. "I want to sue every media outlet that published false information about Maria. I want every cent they pay in damages to go to her, and I want it to be public." "Richard, that's going to cost a fortune in legal fees, and—" "I didn't ask how much it would cost. I asked if you can do it." There was a pause. Then Marcus laughed. "I can, and it will be a pleasure." The hearing took place the following Monday. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, cameras outside, curious onlookers trying to get in. Richard arrived with his legal team, Maria by his side, Isabella at home with her grandmother at everyone's insistence. Edward was there with Beatrice beside him. When their eyes met, Richard didn't feel anger. He felt pity for people who had forgotten what really mattered. The judge, a 60-year-old man with reading glasses, reviewed the documents in silence for long minutes. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Richard Miller, are you aware of the allegations against you?" "I am, Your Honor." "And do you have anything to say?" Richard took a deep breath. "I do. I spent 3 years of my life believing it had ended on the day of the accident. 3 years isolating myself, convincing myself there was no purpose for me. And then a 7-year-old girl walked into my house and reminded me of something I had forgotten, that being alive isn't about walking or not walking. It's about making a difference. And I've finally found a way to do that. If that's insanity, then so be it." The silence in the room was absolute. The judge looked at the medical reports, at the documents presented by both sides. "A decision will be rendered in 48 hours. This hearing is adjourned." Outside, surrounded by cameras, Richard held Maria's hand. And for the first time, he didn't care who saw. The 48 hours dragged on like 48 days. Richard tried to keep busy, but every minute seemed to last an eternity. Marcus called every couple of hours with updates that weren't really updates. "No decision yet. The judge is reviewing everything carefully. Be patient." Patient. As if patience were something Richard could summon at will. On the morning of the third day, the phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice had a different quality. "The decision is in." Richard felt his heart nearly stop. "And?" "Petition for conservatorship denied. The judge declared you fully competent. Edward lost, Beatrice lost, you won." Richard should have felt relief, he should have felt victorious, but what he felt was just a strange emptiness, as if all the adrenaline that had kept him going for the past few weeks had evaporated all at once. "Richard, are you there?" "I'm here, thank you, Marcus, for everything." "There's more. The judge was harsh with Edward, mentioned bad faith litigation. Your brother will have to cover all court costs, and he ordered him removed from any administrative role in the family companies until further notice." Richard closed his eyes. It was more than he had expected, more than he had wanted, really. And Beatrice? She wasn't penalized directly, but the judge made it clear her participation was questionable. "The decision is public. It'll be in the papers today." After hanging up, Richard sat in the silence of the living room. He had won. Legally, officially, he had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something, but he wasn't sure what. The phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller, this is Dr. Henry. Campos from St. Luke's Hospital. I need to talk to you about Maria Garcia." Richard's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "She was admitted last night, collapsed from extreme exhaustion. We ran a full workup and—" "Mr. Miller, we found something." Richard couldn't form words. "There are masses in her lungs. We need to run more tests, but the outlook is concerning, very concerning." The world seemed to tilt. "Where's Isabella?" "With her grandmother. Mrs. Garcia asked that we not tell the girl anything until we're sure. But I thought you should know. She mentioned your name several times while she was disoriented from the medication." Richard didn't even say goodbye. He just hung up and yelled for George. 15 minutes later, he was at the hospital, maneuvering his chair through the white, sterile hallways, with an urgency he didn't know he was still capable of feeling. Maria was in a private room, pale, hooked up to machines but awake. When she saw Richard, she tried to smile. "Mr. Miller, you didn't have to come. I'm going to be fine." Richard moved his chair closer to the bed. "The doctors told me. Maria, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't want to worry anyone. And because I was afraid that if I said it, it would become real." Richard took her hand. It was a small, calloused hand, trembling slightly. "How long have you known?" "About 2 months. I started feeling short of breath, tired. I thought it was just from overwork. When I finally went to the doctor..." Her voice broke. "They said I needed more tests, but I didn't have the money for a specialist, and the public hospital had a long wait list. And then all of this happened, the lawsuit, the news. I couldn't just drop everything and..." "Maria, stop, just stop." Richard squeezed her hand. "You're going to have every test you need, today, now. I'll take care of everything." "Mr. Miller, I can't accept..." "This isn't about accepting. It's about doing what's right. You stood by me when I needed it most. Let me stand by you now." Maria closed her eyes, and tears streamed silently down her face. "And Isabella, how am I going to tell her?" "We'll tell her together, with the truth. She's stronger than you think." But when the time came to tell her, Richard discovered that Isabella already knew. Not the details, not the diagnosis, but she knew something was wrong. Children always know. "My mum is really sick, isn't she?" she asked, sitting on the sofa in Richard's house that afternoon, her grandmother dozing in the chair beside her. Richard nodded. "She is. But the doctors are going to do everything they can to help." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her sketchbook and started to draw something. Richard watched as she drew 2 figures, one larger, one smaller, holding hands. "You know what my grandma always says about prayers?" Isabella asked without looking up from her drawing. "What?" "That sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's wait. The hard part is accepting when it's not yes." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "You're very wise for your age." "I'm not wise. I'm just really scared." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were full of tears she refused to let fall. "But if I let the fear win, who's going to be strong for my mom?" In the days that followed, Richard arranged everything. The best oncologists, the most comprehensive tests, experimental treatments. Maria protested at first, but he gave her no choice. And when the results came back, they were better than feared, but worse than hoped. "It's treatable," Dr. Campos explained, with the careful tone of someone used to giving bad news. "But it's going to be a long road. Aggressive chemotherapy, possibly surgery later. The success rate for this specific type of tumor is about 60% with the right treatment." 60%. Richard did the math in his head. A 40% chance of losing Maria. A 100% chance of Isabella suffering, regardless of the outcome. "When do we start?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the visible fear in her eyes. "Ideally, next week." That night, Richard sat with Isabella in the mansion's garden. It was the first time she had really explored the space. There was a fountain he'd never turned on, flowers he'd never smelled, a stone bench where he'd never sat. "It's pretty here," Isabella said, looking at the stars. "Sad that you never use it." "How do you know I never use it?" "The plants are too perfect. When people use a place, things get a little messy, lived in." Richard looked around and realized she was right. Everything was immaculate but sterile, perfect but lifeless. "Isabella, about your mom. I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to..." "I know," she interrupted him gently. "But there are some things money can't buy. My mom said that. Your mom is wise too. She's the smartest person I know. She taught herself to read, you know, when she was my age. Her grandma couldn't read, so she'd pick up newspapers off the street and ask people to teach her the words." Isabella smiled with pride. "And now she reads a book. A week. Always." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He had a library with over 1,000 books. He'd never read a tenth of them, Maria probably had half a dozen books and read them all repeatedly. "I want to do something," Richard said suddenly. "For your mum. Something special." Isabella looked at him curiously. "What?" "I don't know yet, but something that shows that she matters, that her life has value beyond being your mum or my employee." Isabella thought for a moment. She always wanted a garden, a small one just for her, where she could plant flowers and vegetables, but she never had the space. Richard looked around at the immense and perfectly sterile garden. "Then that's what we'll do." In the following days, while Maria started her treatment, Richard hired a different kind of landscaper, not to keep everything perfect, but to create a space. A corner of the garden was transformed. Flower beds were prepared, seeds were bought, and when Maria had a temporary discharge between chemo sessions, Richard brought her there. She looked at the flower beds, at the carefully arranged tools, at the small wooden sign that read, "Maria's Garden," and she broke down. She cried as Richard had never seen her cry, not from sadness but from something deeper, from being seen, from mattering. "Why?" she asked between sobs. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Richard didn't have a simple answer, so he gave the only one he had. "Because you taught me that being alive isn't about walking or not walking. It's about making a difference, and you made a difference in my life. This is my way of paying it back." Isabella joined them, and the three of them stood there in that corner of the garden that finally had life, knowing that difficult days were ahead, knowing the treatment would be brutal, knowing there were no guarantees, but also knowing that in that moment they were together. And that meant something. 2 weeks later, during Maria's third chemo session, Richard received an unexpected call. It was from the children's home where he had grown up. The director, now a woman in her 70s, was retiring. "Mr. Miller, we found something in the old files. A letter from you. From when you left, it said you would come back, that you would help. I've kept it. All these years, waiting. And now I've seen the news about your project. I was wondering, but would it be possible for us to talk?" Richard looked at Isabella, who was asleep in an uncomfortable chair next to her mother in the hospital. He looked at Maria, pale but still smiling even through the pain. "Yes," he replied, "we can talk. It's time for some promises to be kept." But he had no idea that keeping that promise would bring consequences no one could have foreseen, or that some people would do everything in their power to stop it from happening. The foundation was born on a rainy Tuesday. Richard signed the documents in the presence of Marcus, the director of the children's home, and 2 representatives from the oversight board he had specifically assembled to ensure total transparency. It was called the Walking Together Foundation, not because it was about physical walking, but because no one should have to face life alone. The first project would be the complete renovation of the home where Richard had grown up. After that, 2 other shelters in different neighborhoods. They wouldn't just be physical renovations, but structural ones. Psychologists, educators, a mentorship program, preparation for adult life. Maria, even while undergoing treatment, insisted on helping with the planning. Between chemo sessions, she reviewed blueprints, offering practical suggestions from someone who knew the reality of the families the foundation aimed to help. "Rich people think about air conditioning and technology," she said one day, flipping through the architectural plans. "But they forget the basics. Warm clothes for the winter, enough school supplies, a quiet place to study. That's what we need to think about." Richard listened and learned. Every day he discovered how much he didn't know about the world beyond his bubble of privilege. But the happiness was short-lived. 3 weeks after the foundation was official, the problems began. Small at first. A supplier who cancelled a contract without explanation. An architect who refused to continue with the project, citing a scheduling conflict. Permits that took longer than they should at City Hall. Marcus investigated and discovered the truth. Edward was using his connections to sabotage them. Discreetly, methodically, blocking every step. "Is it legal?" Richard asked, trying to control his anger. "Technically, yes. He's not doing anything directly illegal, just advising partners not to work with you, spreading rumors about the foundation's financial instability. So we make noise, we go public. Marcus hesitated. Or you find other partners, people who don't care about Edward's opinion. Getting into another public war now, with Maria sick, with Isabella needing stability. Are you sure that's what you want? Richard wasn't sure of anything, but he knew giving up wasn't an option. It was Isabella who had the idea. At 7 years old, with a wisdom she shouldn't have possessed, she suggested, "What if the people we help also helped? Like the boys at the home, they could plant things in the garden, they could help with cleaning. That way everyone is a part of it." The idea was simple but revolutionary for the project. It wouldn't be a place where children just received help, but where they also contributed, where they learned responsibility, care, belonging. Richard redesigned everything. Community gardens, woodworking shops, practical skills courses. The older kids would help the younger ones. Everyone would have chores. Everyone would have a voice. The first visit to the children's home was difficult. Richard hadn't set foot in there in 35 years. The memories came in waves, the smell of cheap soap, the sound of kids running down the halls, the feeling of not belonging anywhere. 15 children were there now, various ages, different stories, but the same look in their eyes, caution mixed with wary hope. The director, Mrs. Davis, introduced them one by one. Richard tried to memorize each name, each face. He tried to see beyond what they showed, and then he saw David, 8 years old, too thin, with dark eyes that seemed to see right through people. He was in the corner, alone, watching everything with an intensity Richard recognized. It was the same intensity he'd had at that age, the same defense against the world. "Hi, David," Richard said, moving his chair closer. "I'm Richard." The boy didn't answer. He just watched the wheelchair with undisguised curiosity. "You can ask," Richard offered. "About the chair. Everyone's curious." "Does it hurt?" David finally asked, his voice hoarse as if it wasn't used much. "Not in the way you think. I can't feel my legs, but other things hurt. On the inside." David nodded, as if he understood perfectly. "I have things that hurt on the inside too." Richard felt his chest tighten. "Want to tell me?" "No." The answer was direct, honest. "But maybe someday." That small conversation stayed with Richard for days. There was something about David that bothered him and fascinated him at the same time, a sadness too old for such a young body. Mrs. Davis confirmed his suspicions. "David arrived 6 months ago. Complicated family situation, doesn't like to talk about it. But he's smart, Mr. Miller. Very smart. Learns everything quickly. He just needs someone to believe in him." Richard decided he would be that someone. But as the foundation began to take shape, Maria got worse. The treatment was brutal. She lost weight, lost her hair, lost the strength that had always seemed inexhaustible. There were days she could barely get out of bed. Isabella was maturing far too quickly. At 7, she knew how to prepare simple meals, manage her mother's medication schedule, and deal with her pain in silence when she thought no one was watching. Richard found her crying in the garden one night, hidden among the plants Maria had started to cultivate. "Hey," he said softly, moving the chair closer. "Can I sit here with you?" Isabella quickly wiped her face. "Sorry, I didn't want anyone to see." "Why not?" "Because if I cry, my mum will get sad, and she's already sad enough." Richard felt something break inside him. "Isabella, you're 7 years old. You're allowed to cry. You're allowed to be scared. But who's going to be strong if I'm not?" "I will." The words came out before Richard could think. "I'll be strong. For you. For your mum. Let me carry this for a while." Isabella looked at him with those 2 old eyes, and then did something unexpected. She stood up and hugged Richard. A tight, desperate hug from someone who had been holding the world on her shoulders, and was finally given permission to put the weight down. Richard hugged her back, feeling her tears soak his shirt, feeling his own tears fall silently. They stayed like that until Isabella fell asleep, exhausted. Richard carried her in his arms to the guest room she used when she stayed at the mansion, laid her down carefully, and stood there watching her sleep. When had it happened? When exactly had this girl stopped being just his employee's daughter and become... what? He had no name for what he felt. It wasn't paternal love exactly. It was deeper. It was responsibility. It was protection. It was the certainty that he would do anything to ensure she had the chance to be a child, even if just for a little while longer. The following week, Maria's tests brought conflicting news. The tumor was responding to treatment, but more slowly than expected. They would need more sessions, possibly more invasive surgery. "How long?" Maria asked the doctor, her voice firm despite her visible fear. 3 more months of intensive chemo, then we reevaluate. If all goes well, surgery in 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of pain, of uncertainty, of every day. Being a battle. Richard saw the determination in Maria's face, but he also saw the fatigue, the exhaustion of fighting her own body. "We'll get through this," he said, taking her hand. "Together." But Maria had other plans. "Mr. Miller, I need to ask you something. If something happens to me, if the treatment doesn't work, don't talk like that. Please, let me finish." Her voice was steady now. "If something happens, I need to know that Isabella will be okay. My mother is elderly, she won't be able to care for her alone, and I don't have anyone else." Richard felt the world stop. "Are you asking me to—" "I'm asking you to promise that you'll take care of her, not as an employer or a benefactor, but as someone who truly cares." "Maria, that won't be necessary. You're going to be fine. Promise me." Richard looked at this woman who had come into his life as a cleaner and had become something so much more important. He looked at the determination in her eyes, at the desperate love of a mother trying to protect her child even from the future. "I promise," he said, but you're going to be here to hold me to that promise for many years to come." Maria smiled, but they both knew that sometimes promises are all we have left when the future is uncertain. That night, Richard dreamed of David, of those eyes that saw too much, of the sadness he recognized, of the need to belong that he understood so well. And when he woke up, he was sure of 2 things. The foundation wasn't just about helping, it was about saving. Saving kids like David. Saving the memory of the boy he had been. And maybe, in the process, saving himself. But what he didn't know was that the coming months would bring challenges that would test not only his determination, but his very humanity. That some battles are won not with money or power, but with something far more precious, with the willingness to break completely in order to rebuild yourself differently. And Richard was about to break in ways he never imagined possible. 4 months passed. The Walking Together Foundation was finally taking physical shape. The first children's home, the one where Richard had grown up, had been completely renovated. New walls, windows that actually closed, a heating system that worked. But more important than that, there was life. 23 children now, ages 4 to 16, each with their own story, their own trauma, their own unique way of seeing the world. Richard visited 3 times a week, always accompanied by Isabella when she wasn't at school or with Maria. David had become his special focus. The 8-year-old boy was still quiet, still isolated himself, but there were small changes. He smiled occasionally. He asked questions, and he had an extraordinary talent for math that even his teachers were surprised by. But not everything was a victory. Maria had a severe relapse in the 3rd month of treatment. An opportunistic infection left her hospitalized for 2 weeks. The doctors managed to control it, but the scare was real. Real enough for Richard to spend sleepless nights planning for scenarios he refused to accept as possible. It was during one of those sleepless nights that he got the call. 3 in the morning, an unknown number. "Mr. Miller?" A young, nervous female voice. "My name is Caroline. I work for the city in the social services department. I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Richard sat, up in bed, wide awake. "I'm listening. There's an investigation happening about the foundation. Someone filed an anonymous complaint alleging financial irregularities, inadequate conditions for the children, even abuse." Richard's blood ran cold. "That's absurd. We have all the documentation, all the permits, monthly inspections." "I know, sir. That's why I'm calling. Off the clock. This investigation, it's not normal. It's being pushed from above. Someone with a lot of power wants to find problems even if they don't exist. Who? There was a pause. I can't say for sure, but there are rumors involving your brother, and some people connected to the home's previous administration who lost contracts when the foundation took over. Richard hung up feeling nauseous. Edward again, always Edward. But this time, it wasn't just about money or power. It was about destroying something good, something that was working. The next morning, Marcus confirmed it. The investigation was real and would be rigorous. They're going to comb through every cent, every document, every employee. They'll interview the kids, the teachers, everyone. If they find any irregularity, no matter how small, they'll use it against you. There are no irregularities. There's always something, Richard. A misplaced receipt, an employee without all their paperwork in order, a kid who got hurt playing. They'll twist everything to look like negligence. Richard spent the next few days in war mode. He reviewed every document 3 times. He spoke with every employee. He made sure everything was absolutely perfect. But too perfect was also suspicious, apparently. The inspection happened on a rainy Tuesday. 5 city inspectors, 2 social workers, a psychologist. They spent 8 hours at the home, examining every corner, asking questions, taking notes. Richard was there, watching it all from his wheelchair, feeling helpless in a way he hadn't felt since the accident. Isabella was there too, having insisted on coming against everyone's advice. She was the one who noticed it first. One of the inspectors, a middle-aged man with a perpetually unpleasant expression, was pressuring David, asking rapid, aggressive questions, trying to get him to say something that could be used. Do they hit you here? Has anyone ever hurt you? Do they force you to work against your will? David was getting paler and more withdrawn by the second. Richard started to move toward them, but Isabella was faster. "Hey," she said, planting herself between the inspector and David. "You can't talk to him like that, you're scaring him." The man looked down at her with disdain. "Little girl, this is none of your business. Get out of here." "It is my business. You're being mean, and mean people shouldn't be in charge of taking care of kids." The inspector turned red. "Listen here, you little—" "Enough!" Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. He rolled up, his chair positioned protectively in front of the 2 children. "Any questions for the children will be asked in the presence of a psychologist and a legal representative. If you want to continue this line of questioning, I'll need you to call my lawyer." The inspector tried to argue, but the lead inspector, a woman in her 50s with tired but kind eyes, intervened. "He's right, Frank. Let's keep this professional." After the inspectors left, Richard found David hiding in the bathroom, shaking. Not from the cold, but from something much deeper. "Hey," Richard said softly from the doorway. "Can I come in?" David didn't answer, but he didn't say no. Richard entered, closing the door behind him. "That man was a jerk, and he was wrong to talk to you like that." "He wanted me to say you guys are bad," David finally said, his voice a whisper. "That you hit us. That you do bad things." "And did you?" "No. Because it's not true." David looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "It's good here. It's the best place I've ever lived. Why does someone want to ruin it?" Richard had no answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some people destroy good things just because they can, just because they're hurt or angry or simply can't stand to see others happy? "I don't know, David, but I promise you one thing. I won't let anyone ruin this. This place is yours, all of yours, and no one is going to take that away." But making that promise was easier than keeping it. 2 weeks later, the preliminary report leaked to the press. It was full of concerns and issues to be investigated. Nothing concrete, nothing proven, but enough to plant doubt. Millionaire's Foundation under investigation for possible irregularities. Children at risk, Richard Miller funded home faces allegations. The headlines were calculated to cause maximum damage, and they worked. Potential donors who had pledged contributions started to back away. Families who were considering mentorship cancelled their visits, and then came the blow Richard hadn't expected. 3 families pulled their children out of the home. They said it was for their safety that they wanted to wait for the investigation to end. But Richard knew the truth. They were scared. Scared of the association, scared of the repercussions. One of the children who left was a close friend of David's, a 9-year-old girl named Julia who always made David laugh. When she left crying and looking back, David said nothing. He just went back to the corner where he used to stay before Richard came into his life. Isabella tried to comfort him. She'll be back when all this is over. But David just shook his head. Nothing good ever lasts. I already knew that. That sentence haunted Richard for days. The bitter resignation of a child who had already learned he couldn't trust anything. The sadness of someone used to loss. Maria, though weak from her treatment, noticed how much this was affecting Richard. "You're thinking about giving up," she said one night. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking that maybe Edward is right, that I'm just a broken man trying to fix things I don't know how to fix. Do you know why Isabella prayed for you that first day?" Richard shook his head. "Because she saw something in you that she recognized. Pain. But not just pain. The need to make a difference despite the pain. She didn't pray for you to walk, Richard. She prayed for you to find purpose. And you found it. Don't let bad people take that away from you." "What if I'm not strong enough?" Maria smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Then be weak, but be weak doing what's right. It's better than being strong doing what's wrong." That night Richard made a decision. He called a press conference. Against Marcus's advice, against his own caution, he decided to speak. The room was packed. Cameras, reporters, onlookers. Richard entered, his wheelchair maneuvering through the flashes, and got straight to the point. 3 months ago, 23 children had a home, a safe place, a chance. Today, 3 of them have been taken away out of fear. Fear planted by lies and manipulation. Are they investigating my foundation? Great. Investigate. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. But while you investigate, think about the children. Think about David, who was starting to trust the world again. Think about Julia, who cried when she left. Think about all the children who will suffer while you search for scandals that don't exist. There were murmurs in the room. Richard continued. "My brother wants to destroy me. My ex-wife abandoned me. Half the world thinks I'm crazy or manipulated. And you know what? Maybe I'm a little of both. But I'm also someone trying to do something right, and I'm going to keep trying even if it costs me everything, because these kids deserve it." The silence that followed was absolute. Then a reporter raised her hand. "What if the investigation does find problems? What if they shut down the home?" Richard looked directly into the camera. "Then I'll appeal, I'll fight. I'll use every resource I have because giving up on these children is not an option." Afterward, in the van, Richard fell apart. He shook, he cried, he let out all the pent-up tension. George, the driver, just drove in silence, giving him his privacy. When he got home, Isabella was waiting. She didn't say anything. She just hugged Richard and whispered, "You were brave today." And for the first time in weeks, Richard felt that maybe, just maybe, he could survive what was coming. But he had no idea that the biggest twist was yet to come, and that it would change everything he thought he knew about his own story. The investigation lasted 6 weeks, 6 weeks of uncertainty, of sleepless nights, of every little detail being scrutinized. But when the final report came out, it was unanimous. No irregularities found. The foundation was operating within all regulations, the children were well cared for, and the resources were being used appropriately. Edward tried to appeal, to question, to prolong it, but there was no basis. He had lost again. The revenge, however, came from where Richard least expected it. It was an ordinary Thursday when Mrs. Davis called, her voice trembling. "Mr. Miller, you need to come here now. It's about David." When Richard arrived, he found the boy sitting in the director's office, staring at the floor with that expression he knew so well. The expression of someone preparing to lose everything all over again. "What happened?" Richard asked. Mrs. Davis sighed. "An aunt showed up, from out of state, said she only just found out where David was. She wants custody." Richard felt the world stop. "But Has she been vetted? Did anyone check if she's fit? Yes, everything is in order. She has a stable income, owns her own home, no criminal record. Legally, as a blood relative, she has preference. Richard looked at David. The boy still hadn't looked up. David, Richard called softly. Do you know this aunt? A minimal nod. Do you want to go with her? Silence, then so quiet it was barely audible. It doesn't matter what I want. Those words broke something in Richard. He turned to Mrs. Davis. Give me a minute with him, please. When they were alone, Richard moved his chair closer. Look at me, David. The boy finally raised his eyes. They were red. What you want matters. It always matters. Tell me the truth. I want to stay. David's voice broke. But she's family, and family always takes you away, even when you don't want to go. Richard felt tears burn his eyes. He knew this pain. He was 8 when he was taken to the home. He was 17 when he left. In all those years, he never had a choice about where he stayed. If I could change this, Richard said, his voice choked, I would. But you can't. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. Richard wanted to argue, to say he would fight, that he would find a way. But he knew the system. He knew the laws. Relatives had priority, and for good reason most of the time. David's aunt came to get him 2 days later. She was a woman in her 30s, with a simple appearance and a nervous smile. She seemed genuinely happy to be reunited with her nephew, but David was frozen. We're going to be happy together, she said, stroking the boy's hair. You'll see. Richard watched from a distance, helpless in his wheelchair, helpless in every way that mattered. When David walked past him, carrying his single backpack of belongings, he stopped. Thank you, the boy whispered, for believing in me. And he was gone, just like that, as if the last few months had never happened. Richard went home feeling an emptiness greater than what he'd felt before meeting Isabella, because now he knew what. It was to care, and caring meant you could lose. It was Maria who came to him that night. She was stronger now, the treatment finally showing consistent results. The doctors spoke of remission with cautious hope. You did what you could, she said, sitting next to him on the sofa. It wasn't enough. It never is. But you gave him something no one else did. You gave him hope. You gave him the possibility of believing that he matters. That doesn't just disappear because he's gone. Richard wanted to believe her, but the pain was too great. The months that followed were strange. The foundation grew. 2 more homes were renovated. 50 children now had a better place to live. Families started to show interest in mentorship. Donations came in from ordinary people, touched by the story. Maria went into full remission. 5 months after her diagnosis, the doctors declared the cancer was under control. She would still need follow-ups, but she was alive. She was getting well. Isabella, now 8, flourished, smart, determined, full of dreams. She talked about becoming a doctor or a teacher, or maybe working with kids like Richard did. And Richard. Richard was finding himself, not as the man he was before the accident, that cold businessman focused only on profit, but as someone new, someone who understood that strength didn't come from control, but from vulnerability. He was still in the wheelchair. There was no spectacular miracle, but there were improvements, little tingles that came and went, days when he could move a few of his toes. The doctors spoke of a possible partial recovery, but with no guarantees. Richard learned that was okay, that walking or not walking didn't define who he was. And then, 6 months after David left, the final twist happened. Richard was at the original home overseeing the installation of a new library when his phone rang. An unknown number. Mr. Miller, a female voice, familiar, but one he couldn't place. It's Caroline, the social worker. Remember me? I'm the one who warned you about the investigation. I remember. What's happened? It's about David. The situation with his aunt. It didn't work out. She had good intentions, but she wasn't prepared. David is re-entering the system. And he specifically asked to come back to your home. Richard felt his heart race. When? Tomorrow. If you'll still have him. If he would have him, Richard could barely say yes before his hands started to shake. The next morning he was there when the social services car arrived. David got out, too thin, his eyes more tired. But when he saw Richard, something in his face changed. He ran. He just ran and threw himself into Richard's arms, nearly tipping the chair over. "You're still here," David sobbed against Richard's shoulder. "I thought you'd be gone, that you wouldn't want anything to do with me anymore." Richard hugged him tightly, feeling his own tears fall. "Never. I'm never leaving." And in that moment, Richard realized the truth he had been avoiding for months. It wasn't just about helping children. It was about this child. It was about David, and maybe about all the children he saw in David, including the boy he himself had once been. In the days that followed, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He talked to lawyers, to social workers, to psychologists. And then, on a quiet afternoon, he sat down with David. "I have a question to ask you," Richard said, "and you can say no. It won't change anything between us." "I promise." David watched him intently. "Would you like to come live with me? Not as an official adoption, because that's complicated and takes time, but as a foster placement, as a chosen family." David didn't answer right away. His eyes filled with tears. "Chosen family," he repeated. "Yes, the family we choose, not by blood, but by love. What if I do something wrong? What if you realize you don't want me anymore?" Richard took the boy's small hand. "David, I spent 3 years of my life thinking I had no purpose, that I was just a broken man in a chair. And then you came into my life and showed me that being broken doesn't mean being dead. You taught me that mattering doesn't require working legs. It requires a beating heart, and my heart beats for you. Do you understand?" David nodded, now crying openly. "Can I call you Uncle Richard?" "You can call me whatever you want, my boy." And it was in that nickname, my boy, that Richard finally understood. He had spent his entire life trying to control everything, build empires, accumulate wealth. But the real wealth was right here in an 8-year-old boy who had chosen him as family. 3 months later, in a simple ceremony in the mansion's garden, the garden Maria had transformed from sterile to alive, the foster care placement was finalized. David officially moved into Richard's house. Isabella was there, beaming, officially declaring herself David's cousin. Maria was there too, now completely cancer-free, her eyes shining with happiness. And Richard, sitting in his wheelchair surrounded by his chosen family, realized something extraordinary. He was standing. Not physically, his legs still didn't fully work, but emotionally, spiritually, he was standing for the first time in years. "You know what my biggest miracle was?" Richard asked Isabella that afternoon. "Learning to walk again," she answered, knowing it wasn't. "No, learning to feel again. Learning that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about finding the beauty in the cracks." Isabella smiled, now 8 and still too wise for her age. "And you know what my biggest miracle was?" "What?" "It wasn't getting an uncle," she said, looking at Richard and then at David. "It was seeing my mom alive. It was seeing you happy. It was seeing that we can choose our family." David came closer, holding Richard's hand on one side and Isabella's on the other. "And my biggest miracle was learning that I matter, that I always mattered." Maria joined them, and the 4 of them stood there in the garden where it had all begun with a simple prayer. The garden where Richard had cried for the first time in years. The garden that was now alive just like him. The afternoon breeze rustled the leaves of the plants Maria had cultivated. The Walking Together Foundation now helped over 100 children. Edward had vanished from Richard's life, defeated and bitter. Beatrice had moved on with her life, and Richard finally understood that the real miracle was never about walking. It was about finding reasons to stand, even while sitting. It was about discovering that family isn't about blood or genes. It's about who stays, who chooses to stay, who chooses you back. That night, as he tucked David into the bed they had set up together, the boy asked a question. "Uncle Richard, Do you still feel pain? In your legs? Richard thought. Sometimes. But you know what I discovered? The pain reminds me that I'm alive, and being alive now is worth every bit of pain I've ever felt. David smiled, that rare, precious smile. Me too, it hurts to remember before, but it hurts less when I remember that I have now. I have you. I have here. And in those simple words from a child was all the wisdom Richard had spent a lifetime searching for. The past hurts, but the present heals if you let it. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, it happened. Richard was in physical therapy with David nearby, doing homework. And then he felt it. Not a tingling, real movement. He managed to flex his ankle, then his knee. It wasn't an instant miracle. He didn't stand up and walk away. But it was progress. Real, measurable, scientific progress. "David," he called, his voice shaking. "Look." The boy looked and saw. He saw his uncle's foot move. And he screamed. He screamed with happiness, called for Maria, called for Isabella. And as they all gathered, crying and laughing, Richard realized the final truth. He had already been walking, for months, not with his legs, but with his heart. And that had always been what mattered. 2 years later, Richard could take a few steps with support. He never walked completely, like he used to. But he didn't need to. He had David running by his side. He had Isabella growing up strong and determined. He had Maria, alive and healthy, tending to her garden. And he had peace. The peace of knowing his life had meaning, not for the millions he had accumulated, but for the lives he had touched, for the boys and girls at the foundation who now had a chance, for turning his pain into purpose. The silence of the mansion was no longer empty. It was the good silence of the afternoon, punctuated by laughter, conversations, life. And when Richard looked out the window at the garden, he saw more than plants. He saw a future. He saw hope. He saw proof that even the most broken things can bloom when they find the right soil. He was no longer the man he had been, nor the man he had become after the accident. He was someone new, someone better, someone who had finally learned the most important truth of all. Walking together isn't about moving your legs, it's about moving your heart. And Richard's heart, at last, was in motion.